I'm going to go over some of the characteristics of effective qualitative data analysis. Now, all these characteristics don't necessarily need to be present in a paper, but the more of them that are included, the more we have confidence in the actual data reported and the analysis interpretation. So the first feature I'm going to discuss is whether the actual analysis or interpretation is transparent. And what I mean by that is the way you actually categorized or looked at the data needs to be articulated in some way so that the reader understands your thinking. So for example, if I took a look at a long transcript and started to categorize certain responses, then I need to be clear of my thinking and steps to actually putting the data in certain categories. Without that, we're left to sort of guess at what the researcher was doing when they were analyzing the data. So that's pretty important, and it's typical for a good content analysis. The second feature is credibility of data, and the main issue there is we want to avoid obvious bias in interpretation. And one good way of doing that is getting a second person to look at the data and see if their interpretations match our own. It's called inter-rater reliability, but it's good practice in double-checking our assumptions, because sometimes we can be biased without noticing it. Now that can be hard to do, getting a second person to look at all your data. So you might get them to look at random aspects of your data and see if they correlate well with what your interpretations were. Or if you don't include this element in your analysis, you have to make sure that your transparency is really well done so that we understand and can criticize or support or evaluate the way you've looked at data. It is also important to report negative cases when you look at qualitative data. And what I mean by that is that sometimes we can see a pattern in the data. In fact, often we're looking for patterns. And then once we see that pattern, we start to develop a confirmatory bias. So we look for information that supports that pattern and ignore information that doesn't. Typically, qualitative data isn't that clean. So it's important to, even though there may be a predominant trend, to identify cases that actually go against that trend, or what I'm calling negative cases, so that I feel as a reader that you have a balanced perspective in terms of your analysis. Another feature that is important is it's called triangulation, and what that means is having two or more sources of data collected on the same topic, or collected from the same person or group of people. So you might have observations, for example, plus interview data. You might even have survey data. And you want to see how those three sources of data converge to support perhaps a similar pattern, theme, hypothesis. So having more than one source of data is always a good idea, sometimes referred to as mixed methods as well. And that's a really good practice. Another good practice is to have a participant from whom you've collected data actually check your interpretations, so that if you make interpretations and then draw some conclusions, it's good practice to actually bring it back to the participant. And that can be hard to do, but if it's possible, and say, do I have this right? Am I interpreting what you said correctly? That certainly increases confidence in the results in the analysis. Another good practice is to provide rich descriptions of the data. I've seen qualitative papers, and they've collected a tremendous amount of data, hours and hours of transcripts, and yet few rich descriptions or quotes are offered. And the key benefit of, or one of the key benefits of qualitative data analysis is to provide rich contextual descriptions so we can understand the picture or the situation in detail. So you want to provide those if you have that information or if that's the kind of data you've collected. And the final feature that should be included in both qualitative or quantitative analysis is a caveat section, or in other words, limitations. And with respect to qualitative analysis, you want to report any biases that you might have in data collection, analysis, or interpretation. So for example, if you have a particular philosophy or approach, it's important for you to bring that out up front so that the reader understands that there are biases. We all have biases, but it's important to articulate them if you can. And for example, if you're the teacher and you're trying out a different method and you're also the researcher, well, clearly your bias might be in support of that method, otherwise you wouldn't try it. And so you might state that up front. You should state that up front. So in other words, caveats are limitations that you have noted in your analysis, so that again the reader understands that you understand this analysis is anything but perfect. We all know that. No analysis is perfect, but that you are acknowledging that there are limitations in the analysis, and that is the sign of a very good researcher. So those are some key qualities that you should consider when conducting qualitative data analysis.